John chapter 10, verse 22. Now it was the feast of dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter. We need to stop right there. It was the feast of the dedication in Jerusalem, and it was the winter. Do y'all remember what the last feast was we just looked at? It was the Feast of the Tabernacles. And this was a God-ordained feast from the Old Testament that they observed in Jerusalem every year, somewhere around September or October. And so that's kind of where we believe that up to this point, up to verse 21 of chapter 10, is actually within a day or so of the Feast of the Tabernacles. And so now we've got the Feast of Dedication. So it's good because the Bible a lot of times gives us little milestones or markers, if you will, to say how and exactly where we're at. So what this means is that it's about 2.5 months from where we left off a couple of weeks ago. We're going to look at why we know it's 2.5 months. For one, you can look on the Jewish calendar and you will see that this is basically December right here. Of course, it says that it's winter, so that makes sense. But you can look on the Jewish calendar, but you actually can't look in the Old Testament to see where the feast of the dedication was. Why is that? Well, the Feast of the Dedication is not in the Old Testament. This is actually an additional feast that was added by the Jews that you cannot find in the Old Testament. That's kind of neat. I like that because a lot of times when we're looking in Scripture and they give these little landmarks, these little milestones in the year of Caesar, Augustus, or whatever, we can actually go and look at history and it actually validates some things for us. We can see in history that the Bible is accurate and it's true. So we're going to actually have to look at history for a moment here because the Feast of the Dedication is evidently a valid Jewish, now when I say valid, we're not saying that it was valid as we can go and see from the Old Testament, but I do believe that it's a valid deal. Here's this validity that was actually being observed in Jerusalem because we do find that in the Scriptures here in verse 22, that it was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem and it was winter. And so let's take a quick look at this. Let's think about this Feast of Dedication. How did this come into the New Testament here if there was none in the Old Testament? Let's do a little history lesson. Did anybody enjoy history when they were in school? I loved history. I didn't like a whole lot about school, but I liked history because you didn't have to memorize any formulas or whatever. You just went and read the story. I loved history. So when we look at history, we find an individual by the name of Alexander the Great. You've heard of Alexander the Great. He was a ruler of the Greek Empire, and they were just conquering. And you see these like the Roman Empire is what's ruling right now, right? We look at that all the time, and we say the Romans this and the Romans that. The Romans crucified Jesus. But prior to the Roman Empire was the Grecian Empire, and Alexander the Great had conquered most of what people would call the known world anyway. So if we were to take a look at that, we would see that the Greek Empire is right here in the red. If you look at the screen there, this is what Alexander had conquered. Now these things, depending on what time frame you look at, these maps changed a little bit, but of course it was changing a little bit. Alexander the Great, somewhere around, I think it's 323 BC, he died. Okay, BC. All right, so we know that when we're looking at history, when we say things happened in 2013, we count down from where we're at, 2015, 2013. When you go to BC, you're doing the other thing. So 330 BC, well, more recently was 320 BC and 310 BC and 300, all the way till you get to that breaking point, and then you start saying AD. Okay, well, we didn't need to do that part for math, but here or for history. So here we got about 323 BC, Alexander the Great dies. Well, what happens is that he's got generals all in this area. And the generals, as many people do, one of the first things they want to do, they want to start saying, hey, I'm in charge now. So what happens immediately is you find a division. And so the people, the generals, actually divide up And you see these maps are constantly changing as you're looking through history. We're looking at 4 of the divisions here. There were actually more than that. But what we're going to look at quickly here are the empires, the Seleucid Empire. And you see down here where the Ptolemy was this guy's name, the Ptolemy Empire. You see it's out kind of the south. See where Jerusalem is there, looking at the area? Well, that's, as you look up in the Seleucid Empire, that's where that was in control. So you got these generals that basically divided the empire. Well, what do we know even from Scripture? What does Jesus say? He says that a kingdom, this applies to a kingdom, an empire, a house, divided against itself, what? Will not stand. Unity is important. We need unity here in our body here. We need to be in unity, but, greed and desire for ambition and power and all that kind of stuff leads to these different divisions. We're going to be looking mainly here at the Seleucid Empire, because at about 170 something BC, you got 150 years or so since Alexander has died, and now you have the general's descendants that are now kings and over these different lands. Well, there's a particular Yahoo, is what I'm going to call him, a character by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, self-given name Epiphany. Antiochus, he was the king of the Seleucid Empire there. Well, as he, just like any of them, they want the whole thing. They want the whole thing to themselves. And he's expanded. And he's actually, if you look at some of the maps, his empire wasn't quite where it is right there. He's actually expanding, and he actually wants Egypt. He's actually going to come and try and take Egypt from Ptolemy. This is history. We're outside of the Bible for a minute, but we need this for a moment. He's going to try and take Egypt. But there's a new kid on the block, so to speak. And it's the Roman Empire. Well, the Roman to be empire. They are actually on the rise, and they're very, very powerful, and they will actually become the new empire that basically kind of rules everything and brings us into Jesus' time and that we're aware of. But they're already extremely intimidating to the Greeks. Matter of fact, as Ptolemy, as you can see here from the screen, and I'm going to move over here, and as you see from the screen, as Ptolemy, he's from over here, right? Or excuse me, as Ptolemy's here, and Antiochus is over here. He actually gets his troops ready together, and he starts making his way over here. He's going to take Egypt. Well, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that as Alexander was taking over and conquering all these nations, he was doing what's called Hellenization. He was indoctrinating all the countries to be Greek. He actually would set up the Greek gods, Zeus, and all this stuff that you're aware of from history, that he would establish this everywhere he went, and it was called Hellenization. It was Greecifying, if you will, the lands and the countries that they would conquer. But for some reason, not Israel. Alexander didn't mind. Israel was still able to operate Judah and continue with Judaism. And so what we'll find here is that maybe Seleucid Empire, maybe Antiochus, maybe he thought that was part of the problem. Maybe everybody needed to be Greecified. They needed to be Hellenized. They needed to be Greeks. So he starts pushing to be Greek in Jerusalem. But it's not as aggressive at first, but it gets more aggressive. We don't know exactly all of what Antiochus and what his intentions were, what his motives were, but we know the results. Some of those we know is he comes through here and he comes down to take Egypt. There's I can't think of the Roman senator's name, but there's a Roman senator there. He's got a small band of Roman soldiers. And he actually kind of meets him on the way. And he says, by the way, you're not going to take Egypt, because if you take Egypt, you're declaring war against Rome. Well, here is Antiochus with all these soldiers, and they're ready to roll. And he says, what? So here's this Roman senator, probably standing there as a senator. He wasn't a soldier. He's a senator, probably in his ugly old toga, standing there, and he says, "You ain't going to take Egypt." Now, of course, Antiochus could have taken the senator and the Roman soldiers that were there. They were greatly outnumbered, but this is how bold this Roman senator was. He says, "I want to know right now what you're going to do. You're going to try and take Egypt? Let me know." Antiochus says, well, he realizes how powerful Rome is, and he thinks for a minute. He says, "Well, I'll let you know." The senator says, here, he starts drawing in the sand, and he draws a circle all the way around Antiochus, and he says, "If you step out of this circle without letting me know, you have declared war on Rome." Wow. That's a bold little toga guy right there. And so, but here's the thing is that, yeah, it was just one man there and a few Roman soldiers, but he had the backing of all of Rome. And so Antiochus, with a little bit of intelligence, says, "Okay, I'll just be content with what I've got." But he went away mad. He went away mad. Matter of fact, as he's angry, he's going back, and guess where he's got to go through? Jerusalem. He's all dressed up and no place to go. All ready for a party, all ready for a war, ain't got no enemy to fight. Well, there are several reasons why he was motivated. For one, now that Rome is taking control, the tribute to Rome is going to be heavy for Antiochus. He could use some money, and he could use some venting of his anger. There's a lot of things that play into this, but one thing we know from history is that he takes over Jerusalem. And he says, "No more will you practice Judaism." Matter of fact, it's outlawed. You can't even circumcise your kids. It goes on and gets worse. He takes some money from the temple, actually starts setting up people from within Judaism that's ready to convert to Hellenism and be somewhat of a hybrid of Hellenism and Judaism, and says, "Hey, look, there's a guy named Jason that actually bought from Antiochus the right to be the high priest." It got ugly. It was not of God. And it continued to get worse. In addition to completely outlawing Judaism, they actually went in and set up altars to Zeus and the Greek gods, and replaced the God of the Jews with the God of the Greeks. And even on the altar where they would sacrifice, the Jews would sacrifice to God, they set up and sacrificed pork on the altar that would normally be sacrificing to God. Pork is something that a Jew didn't even touch. It was the extreme offense, saying, "You people will be Greeks or die." So much so that if you were caught practicing Judaism, if a woman circumcised her child on the 8th day, like the scripture said, they would actually go out and hang her with her child around her neck. It was ugly. This guy was bad. Antiochus was bad news. He wasn't even a pretty guy, really. If you take a look right here, I forgot I got a picture of this guy. Well, it's a likeness anyway. So here's Antiochus, and he has set up his rule over the Jews. And he goes on back about his way, but he leaves a band of his soldiers to make sure and enforce everything the way that it should be. Well, good thing that there were still some people that had a zeal for God. And there was a fellow by the name of Mattathias. He was actually a high priest, and there was a place, actually not in Jerusalem, where they were going to. One of the kings was making the Jews do a sacrifice to these Greek gods, and nobody really was interested in doing it, but this one Jewish guy, he did get up to go ahead and do it for the king. And Mattathias, he just had his fill, and he came in there and he actually killed the guy, killed the king right there, and tore down the altar, said, "No, we're not going to do this." Then he went and ran in the hid in the hills with his 5 sons. But they were regrouping. And actually what happened is they came back with his sons. And of his 5 sons, Judah Maccabea is what they called him. It actually means the hammer. He was, of the 5 sons, he was the one that was a real warrior. And they just provoked a revolt against the Greeks right there. And in a period of about 3.5 years, they actually turned and won back Jerusalem. And it was a great victory, and the Jews to this day consider it the greatest victory and one of the greatest champions ever in Jewish history. And so you do have this revolt. And I actually want to share, I think I have, you can read in the book of the Maccabees, that's in the Apocrypha. We don't recognize that as part of the canon of Scripture. So, but there's the accounts of all this. But what we do want to at least acknowledge is that there was a Jewish historian that you've probably heard of by the name of Josephus, and he wrote, in the War of the Jews, he wrote, in 167 BC, the king, being thereto disposed beforehand, complied with them and came upon the Jews with a great army. This is King Antiochus, and he is complying with the Romans and not going to take Egypt. And he came upon the Jews with a great army and took their city by force and slew a great multitude of those that favored Ptolemy. Remember that guy? There were some Jews that kind of liked Ptolemy. He said, "Oh, you like Ptolemy? I don't like Ptolemy." And so he takes it out on them. This is straight from without edit. This is straight from Josephus here. And sent out of his soldiers to plunder them without mercy. He also spoiled the temple and put a stop to the constant practice of offering a daily sacrifice for 3 years and 6 months. And it was short-lived because of the Maccabean revolt. I want to try and wrap this up real quick. But I think it's interesting to see how this Feast of the Dedication came. Well, after the Feast of Dedication, or after the revolt was a success, well, they had to go in and reinstitute worship and sacrifice in the temple. Well, when they go into the temple, it's been defiled, completely defiled by these Greeks. So they go in and they start cleaning everything up and replacing everything and rebuild the altars and everything. And so they actually get ready, and they're going to have a feast of dedication, dedicating the temple back to God, saying, "This is for you." Now, here's the thing. They had these vessels of oil that they would use for the lamp. And they only had one of these vessels that weren't defiled by the Greeks. And it was actually had to have the high priest stamp on it. And you can find all this in history. But they went to go, and there was not enough to do what is typical of a feast, is for it to last 8 days. You remember the Feast of the Tabernacle? 8 days. These feasts last 8 days. And so to have an 8-day feast, you need to have this candle burning, right? Well, they didn't have enough but for 1 day. But once they lit it, according to history, now this is not in the Bible, but according to history, they lit that one candle, and although it should not have burned for 1 day, it supernaturally, in their eyes, and that it was from God, it lasted for a complete 8 days. That it burned for 8 days. And it's the miracle that they still celebrate to this day. Actually, what they do to this day is they celebrate that 8-day miracle with this. You've seen this as the menorah. And actually, you have the middle candle, and you have 8 candles right here. And for 8 days, they will light each one of those candles. And this was all to recognize this great miracle performed by God in the sustaining of this oil and the multiplying of this oil for 8 straight days. And the Jews still do this to this day for the dedication of the temple. The dedication literally is interpreted, Hanukkah is interpreted dedication. So all that being said, now you know what Hanukkah is. If you don't know what it is, this is Hanukkah, and they're basically having Hanukkah right here. If it says in verse 22, it says the Feast of the Dedication, it literally means the Feast of Hanukkah.